Morning. It truly is a wonderful world. That is really one of the greatest songs in American history, but also a great song internationally. And pretty much anywhere in the world you go, you will hear jazz, and one of the key songs you will hear is What a Wonderful World, because it captures so much optimism and hope for people. First, I want to give thanks to Basil for inviting me. I almost did not make the conference or make the invitation. The invitation was sent in the spring, and at the time I was living in Japan. And I didn't get back until last month, and that's when I first actually saw the invitation. But I talked to Basil, and I went online and read about the Institute, read about ISERM. And it certainly is in alignment with what I think is really an argument that is most often missed when we think about conflict, that actually diversity is positive, that having a broad spectrum of people from different religions, different races, different genders, from different cultures is actually not a negative, it actually is a positive. And that really has not been as central to how we think about conflict and how we think about diversity as it needs to be. So ISERM is really an important step in moving us towards looking at the world from a very different and what I think is a much more positive and long-lasting perspective. And I also want to thank Ambassador Cook for her remarks. I live in Washington, D.C., and it's rare to hear the kind of insight and the kind of really positive message that she delivered that is really about us being part of a global community, being part of the world, and that we're not something separate from that. And that really requires going to the world. It really requires taking yourself to places that are uncomfortable, that are different, but are ultimately more important in helping us to understand how we move forward. My presentation's coming up, great. My presentation today is titled Conflict Matters. And that's in a couple of ways that the way in which we understand conflict should, or that we should address conflict, we should be engaged with these issues around conflict that affect us in all different kinds of ways. What I'm going to do with my presentation is, first of all, begin with a story, then give a general definition of racial and ethnic conflict, and then talk about the causes, and then finally talk a little bit of perspective about how we might move forward in overcoming some of these differences. About a year and a half ago, I took a group of students to Rwanda. And the reason we went, it was a study trip, was to look at not only the genocide and what happened, but also the process of reconciliation. What kind of healing methods, what kind of healing systems were being put in place so that the country could move forward from what was one of the most horrific incidents in human history. And it was actually a very good trip. We were able to visit sites where there had been massacres, but we also spent a lot of time talking to non-government organizations, to government officials about all of the various projects that they were doing in order to move the country to another stage and to get past what had happened last year was 19 years ago. This year is actually the 20th year anniversary of that genocide. Now, as it turns out, about 2 weeks into the trip, we found ourselves at a prison. This picture down here on your far right is a prison. And because this was a trip that I led but was mostly organized by the students were the ones who set the agenda, and unbeknown to their professor, they put this on the agenda. So I'm very curious about how this is happening. So we get to the prison, and this is not an ordinary prison. Now, you have to understand the genocide impacted 100% of Rwanda. Every neighborhood, every village, every town, every community was engaged in that process. People were either perpetrators, victims, or survivors. There was very, very, very few people who were not in one of those three categories. So when the genocide ended and justice had to be dealt, it was, of course, impossible to have a criminal justice system that could handle literally tens of thousands of cases of people who had perpetrated the genocide. So what Rwanda instituted was a village-level system called a gacaca, where villagers basically met the elders and other people in the village, and they made out punishments, if they were required, for people who had been involved in the genocide. Because these were neighbors. These were people who lived next to you, who lived across from you. They were there. And that worked for about 90% of the people who had been involved. Now, a lot of people escaped and went to Burundi and to the DRC and other places, but for people who were caught and people who were known to have been involved, there had to be some form of justice. So that took care of about 90% of people. For the really hardcore, the people who were perpetrators, who had planned the genocide, who had been involved in multiple massacres, who were at every level responsible, they really needed a very different kind of level, and they needed to go to prison. This was one of the prisons that we went to. There were 5,000 people here who were the worst of the worst, who had committed genocide. So we get to the prison, we have a meeting with the warden and his staff, and we talk about what we're there for in terms of investigating the genocide and trying to see how reconciliation is happening. And after that meeting, the prison says, okay, well, let's go meet the prisoners. So we walk out of his office and we go to the yard where virtually all of the prisoners are, all 5,000. And they're dressed in jumpsuits. Some have blue jumpsuits, some have green jumpsuits, some have pink jumpsuits, right? It's a very colorful image, right? So we go there and we're on the second level balcony. And we walk around to the front. The prisoners had been listening to a band playing. And when we walk around to the front and the warden goes to the microphone that's overlooking the yard, the band stops, and then the warden begins talking to the prisoners. And I don't understand Rwanda. I didn't understand the language, but I knew he was explaining that we were guests and we were there, we were visiting. So he's talking and he's talking. Then he stops and then he says, and now we have a few words from the professor. I go, wait, what? And so I'm like, I wasn't planning for this. He said, no, it's okay. We have a few words from the professor. So now the music is stopped. All of my students are looking at me. The warden and his staff are looking at me. 5,000 people are looking at me. So you're not looking to the face of evil. You're looking into 5,000 faces of evil. So he gives me the microphone. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so first let me give a definition of conflict, religious and ethnic conflict, then talk about some of the causes. And I'm going to come back to this story. All right. So conflict can be defined, and there are many, many different definitions, but one that we tend to use at the university, and one that's just pretty straightforward, is that it's a situation where there's a misalignment of interests, goals, perceptions, and power. And this happens at every level, from the individual level to the social level. My 5-year-old and I have a misalignment of interests and perceptions and power. He wants to eat Cheerios for dinner. I want him to eat a salad, right? So there's a misalignment there that we have to resolve, which we tend to resolve. Sometimes he has the power, sometimes I have the power, right? But this also happens at the broader social level, whether we're talking religious conflict, racial conflict, ethnic conflict. There's a misalignment. There's a disagreement over what should be our goals, what should we be aiming for. So that's sort of a broad definition. Let me give what, after many, many years kind of teaching this in this area and working with people around the world in many, many different countries, what are like 6 elements that emerge as we try to understand this. So one is that, and some of this is what Ambassador Clark mentioned as well, one is that conflict is normal. Conflict exists everywhere. In fact, it's often necessary because to get past some of the issues that we have to deal with, we have to raise and recognize that conflict is there. There's a saying, we can't put issues behind us until we put them before us. We have to be not afraid of conflict, but see it as a normal and everyday part of how we live in our world. Second point. However, ethnic and racial conflict that rises to the level of violence and even genocide is not normal. And that's what we want to talk about. That's what we're here to meet and talk about today. And there are certain conditions that have to exist in order for conflict to move from just this ordinary, normal, and routine process to one where it creates a kind of instability and the kind of destabilization that we've seen horribly manifest in so many places around the world. First of all, there has to be a history of grievances. As Ambassador Clark pointed out, none of this falls straight from the sky. No conflict elevates itself to what we saw in Bosnia or what we saw in Rwanda or what we saw in Ireland or what we saw in many different places just overnight. There has to be a long, long, long history. In Rwanda, although most people were unaware, there had been a history of massacres that had happened over the last 30 or 40 years leading up to the genocide that happened in 1994. And that process of these grievances going unresolved and not being addressed just fostered and festered and continued the intensifying antagonisms that would later get exploited in 1994. So when there's grievances, those have to be dealt with. They can't simply be left to, this is over now, and we just keep going forward when you don't get to the causes and the roots of those grievances. Secondly, a crisis of governance, and in particular, when the state loses its monopoly on violence. One of the things we talk about in international relations, one of the things that defines a state and state power is that it has a monopoly over violence. You don't have just any and everybody in society being able to decide when they're going to use violence as a means of going after some particular agenda. So the state has to maintain not only credibility, but it also has to maintain a monopoly over violence. Once that's surrendered, then you create the conditions under which the kind of horrors we've seen will emerge. Third, social institutions also begin then to play a role in breeding hate and intolerance. In Rwanda, the radio. While there was, again, a long history that existed and things were deteriorating, the situation really escalated in the months before the genocide when Rwandan radio went on the air and day after day after day began to demonize and create the circumstances under which the hatred that ultimately was expressed against the Tutsis by the juntas was manifest. It came out in newspapers. It came out in other social institutions as well. So we have to be very vigilant about ways in which these institutions play a role in creating the atmosphere under which intolerance and hate can happen. I think in the United States, we have hate radio. A lot of what we hear coming from the Rush Limbaughs and from other sectors of extreme conservative reporting really does create an atmosphere where you get the misperceptions, you get the kind of social frictions that are unnecessary. And they're not based on people's real real differences and systems of oppression that people are experiencing is based on this convening of ideas around people's situations in society. And so it becomes very, very important that we watch and see how these institutions also play a role in these really, really horrific ethnic and racial conflicts around the world. Point number 4. Also, we see in these circumstances, political leaders emerge. As the situation in the Balkans was falling apart, what really drove that situation into its murderous stage was that there were a number of leaders that emerged who took advantage of the antagonisms that were there. And they prodded, and they prodded, and they prodded, and they were able to whip people into a frenzy around hatred for the different ethnic and racial groups that people had lived in peace with for decades. So it's really critical that at another stage, we also are able to take a stance against this kind of extremist behavior and language. And Martin Luther King has a very appropriate quote here. He says, "The hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict." So as we hear these voices rise, as we hear this extremist language, we have to speak out against it. We have to take a stand, not see it as something that's passing, not see it as something that's fringe, but in fact, it's corrosive in the body politic. And we have to be, as Martin Luther King indicates, we have to have the courage to stand up against that, even if it begins to become popular, especially if it begins to become popular. Fifth, ultimately, there's also competition over resources. In all of the situations that we talk about, when you boil it down to who has access to the resources in society, there's a vast unevenness that emerges. And that perception and the reality of that unevenness also creates the circumstances under which it's easier to convince people that they have enemies and that they need to rise up and go after those enemies. 6. And then lastly, what begins to emerge is also a difference in rights. And any democratic society that's going to survive has to have an ethos that everybody in society is treated equally. Once you create the circumstances under which there's blatant and overt discrimination against people simply because of who they are, because of the religion they're in, because of their gender, because of their race, because of their class, conflict is inevitable and almost perceptive, and almost always conflict will lead to violence. So it becomes very critical that we also fight for the rights of everybody in society, not just our own rights. And we have to be extremely strong in arguing that there should be equal rights, political rights, civil rights across the board for everybody in our society if we want to avoid rising to these kinds of conflicts. Okay, third point, conflict is universal. Every single group and every single society has engaged in conflict. This is important because often what happens is we narrow our sense down to conflict only comes from certain parts of society. There are only certain parts of society that engage in riots. There are only certain parts of society that are violent, that commit these kind of horrible crimes. In fact, every part of society and every group in society has these dynamics. And that's important because then we don't lose ourselves in creating an image of one group as superior to another group culturally and in other ways as well. Fourth, conflict is both individual and social at the same time. As we figure out ways how to deal with conflict in our personal lives, this also impacts our social lives. And most important, I think, is to understand that the way to conflict resolution, the means is as important as the end. You cannot violence your way to a peaceful end. There has to be peaceful means as you move towards peaceful ends, and that becomes really important. Conflict is often more about perception than actual offense. And we know this, again, this comes through ways in which we embody ideological and media-created views of those who are outside of us, those who are culturally different. And we believe that these cultural differences must mean cultural clashes, as opposed to cultural differences mean cultural enrichment. And that becomes very critical as we think about the ways in which, again, at an individual level, but also at a social level, we handle conflict. And then finally, or 5, conflict is reconcilable. We have to start with this principle that, yes, conflict exists. Yes, it can become intense, but we can also address it. And we can address it in ways in which we not only resolve the immediate nature of the conflict, but we get to the causes of the conflict. But if you don't believe conflict is reconcilable, if you believe there are permanent differences between the races, between the religious groups, then you will never get to the point where you can resolve on a social level and on a societal level the conflicts that exist in society. Okay, so here I am in front of these prisoners, right? And I'm trying to figure out, they probably have heard every criticism in the world, right? And they have, they've been through trials, and now they're here. And most of these prisoners, 95% of them are going to die in this prison. They're not getting out. They've got 6, 7, 8 lifetimes. They are not getting out of this prison. So they're going to have to, just in their personal life, figure out, how they're going to deal. So I thought about it. So then I said this: we work in the present with what we learned from the past in order to build a better future. And everyone has a role and responsibility to move society forward, no matter where you find yourself at any given moment. And what I was trying to do was to tell them, this is your situation, but you have a role in society. You have a responsibility, particularly given what you've done in the past, to move things forward. That means not only what you do, but what you say, how you act. You have family, you have friends, you need to be responsible. So this was the message I tried to convey, and later on when I talked to the warden, he said, this is really what we talk about every single day, because again, most of these people recognize they're never going to get out of this prison. It was mostly men, but there were about 1,000 women also in the prison at the same time. So it wasn't just, it was kind of across the board. And women with children, women with families, who they still had to deal with. So let me end it there. I think I'm getting near the end of my time. Thank you so much for your attention, and we can have questions and comments later. Thank you.